Harvard Divinity School.
100 Years Rudolf Steiner, December 15th and 16th, 2025.
Our third speaker now is Professor Henrieke Stahl, Senior Professor for Slavic Literature at the University of Trier. She has led several research projects funded by the German Research Foundation on contemporary Russian language poetry and on the works of Andrei Bely. Her publications include her doctoral thesis on Bely's novels and a monograph on Vladimir Soloviev. She also co-edited a critical edition of Andrei Bely's writings. Let's welcome Professor Stahl, who will be speaking on The Self Can Become Spirit, Andrei Bely on Rudolf Steiner's teaching on the consciousness soul.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are in the section about anthroposophical biographies. The biography I'm speaking about is not the biography of Andrei Bely, but of the consciousness soul. He has written on a huge work, a huge text. So let's start. This lecture will present Andrei Bely's anthroposophic magnum opus, the history of the becoming of the self-consciousness soul, in short, ISSD. I will discuss a current research question, we can say a riddle we are working on with several colleagues at the last time. It's the question about some rhythmic curves he developed in certain drawings. And I will show you how meditational practice condensed in drawings and illustrations are used as tools for generating an understanding of history. And then these imaginations are tools for developing the text. So let's go further on. The Russian symbolist, what?
The bar on the screen, it's possible.
Okay,
it's
can you
possible to
put
get
it
rid of
away?
the bar. Yes, I hope so. Yes, I think I can.
It's still there, yeah. I will go on. The Russian symbolist writer Andrei Bely is a pioneer of anthroposophy in Russia. Bely was a personal student of Rudolf Steiner and helped build the Johannesbau, the precursor to the Goetheanum. Through his theoretical writings and lectures, as well as his literary works, he presented an unconventional interpretation of Rudolf Steiner's teachings, which continues to influence the perception of anthroposophy in Russia to this day. His anthroposophical magnum opus is a cultural philosophical study that described the development of the consciousness soul in the Western world in around 1,000 pages. This work was written between 1926 and 1931. The genesis of this text is linked to a whole series of drawings and graphic designs. The first volume, which is largely a fair copy, contains a number of graphics, where the other volume, which is not yet completed, contains almost no illustrations. First, I will give a brief overview of the drawings associated with the ISSD. Since beginning the anthroposophical esoteric training path, which Bely undertook together with his first wife, the painter and graphic artist Asa Turgenev, under Steiner's personal guidance, drawings have taken on special significance. For him, as an attempt to capture and to express insights gained in meditation. Now the slides are not turning further. What shall I do? It's not going after your operation.
The operation was good, but try that. Do you want to try that?
Try that. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, okay, it's going on. Thank you. But the basic idea of the ISSD has also been captured in drawings. It originates from anthroposophy and describes the constitution and transformation of consciousness, which unfolds in a historical rhythm of cultural epochs expanding around the Christ impulse. The ego on the fourth stage corresponds to the Christ impulse, through which it can accomplish the transformation of the lower layers of the being. This work of transformation is essentially the task of the consciousness soul, whose development is traced by the IESSD. Such drawings bring together complex conceptual relationships in their composition, sometimes also linked to key terms, as if under a magnifying glass. This type of image is reminiscent of the Hermetic tradition, specifically the plates and figures of the Rosicrucians, but without any direct reference to them. From the very beginning, Bely understood anthroposophy as a renewal of Rosicrucianism. Other diagrams, reminds me of Hermetic plates explaining the world and the relationship between the earthly and divine worlds. However, there's one significant difference. While the Rosicrucian plates integrate earthly historical time, they primarily embed the world in the vertical divine hierarchy of being. Even though Bely also divides the world into different layers and sees it as caught between the divine and anti-divine powers, he emphasizes the dynamics of transformation over time. Perhaps the first sketch of the historical curve of the ISSD shows a projection of the spiral onto a plane. This morning we already had seen a certain spiral Steiner has drawn, but Bely understands the spiral in another form. The idea of unrolling history into an unfolding spiral can be traced back to Bely's essays from around 1912. The curve is the instrument with which Bely examines cultural development. According to Bely, it traces the development of the Christ impulse in humanity. The Christ impulse is closely connected with the ego, which uses the consciousness soul as its envelope and instrument. Accordingly, this curve can be viewed in different ways. That's very important. From the perspective of the Christ impulse or from the perspective of humanity, whereby different cultures and ethnic groups within humanity represent different stages of development. This necessarily results in different curves. Go on. The first type is based on a kind of mind map of relationships and continuations with a basic temporal structure. You see it here. This type can be either a more static form, that's on the left side, or a flow pattern that emphasizes developmental dynamics. The latter form is reminiscent of avant-garde verbal images, such as those of Wassily Kamensky. This is a drawing from 1914. The second type translates such relationships into figurative structures that add symbolic meaning. Bely tends to use architectural or geological image substrates. The third type consists of abstract diagrams that are intended to illustrate a small, limited set of facts in the core message. And there are also transitional and hybrid forms. In the ISSD, we find graphics of only the latter abstract type, almost exclusively in volume 1, which is already largely a fair copy. They are used functionally in relation to the text, as is also known from Bely's earlier writings. The first two types of complex representations, on the other hand, are not found in the ISSD. They serve the purpose of self-communication in the work progress. Although it cannot be ruled out that Bely might have included such an overall representation in a future publication. Bely analyzes the development of the consciousness soul using the rhythmic curve of history, which he calls the theme of his book. In the ISSD, he describes its development in 7 phases, beginning with its conception in the 1st century through its connection with the Christ impulse, its prenatal development and birth in the 15th century to its crisis in Bely's present, which represents the turning point in its development into 3 further future phases. In 1927 and 28, Bely depicted the historical curve in several drawings. The diagram from a letter written in 1928 clearly shows how the ideal line of development proceeds. After the Christ impulse was taken up by people in the 1st century, it ascended into the sentient soul, worked through this lower layer, then worked on the intellectual soul again, and ascended to the birth of the conscious soul, which Bely, like Rudolf Steiner, places at the beginning of the 15th century. This is followed by another descent, which now goes down through the intellectual and sentient souls to the astral body, which is reached at the end of the 19th century and in the 20th century, only to ascend again. During the second ascent, according to the ISSD, the previous 3 soul forms are transformed into the imaginative, inspirational, and intuitive souls, allowing the ego to ascend to the manas through the transformation of the astral body. With the manas, the Slavic culture epoch begins, followed by new, even deeper descents and higher ascents. This diagram is further elaborated in another curve drawing from the previous year, 27. This complex drawing uses geological imagery and shows the development from the 3rd to the 6th cultural epoch. The image illustrates how the curve runs through history as a kind of ideotypical line with the different cultures, each of which moves through time and the levels of the soul with different rhythms and dynamics represented as colored stripes. However, the European cultures, which are depicted as carriers of the consciousness soul, neither descend into the realm of the astral, the low point of which is marked by the 20th century in both sketches, nor do they succeed in ascending to the manas. Only the slaves and the Africans reach the manas, both of whom replace the Europeans in the transition to the 6th cultural epoch, without having previously participated in the ascent and descent through the higher soul forms. And at the lowest point of the descent into the astral in the 20th century are the Chinese, the Africans, and a stripe that goes back to prehistoric times in ancient Atlantis. The 1927 drawing thus poses an enigma. What does this curve represent? If the European cultures, which are supposed to carry the consciousness soul, do not follow this curve at all. And a second riddle. Why the low point at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century? When it was during this period that anthroposophy emerged with Rudolf Steiner, who for Bely is not considered a descent into the astral, but on the contrary, who with anthroposophy paved the way for the ascent into manas, and himself stands at the stage of development of manas as a transformed astral body? These questions become even more complex when an earlier drawing is taken into account, which probably dates from before the first draft of the ISSD was written, but is closely related to the genesis of the text. It comes from a collection of graphics that belong to the mind maps type. However, when we draw the curve of the later graphics into this earlier graphic, for comparison, you see it on the slide, the curve runs diametrically opposite to the curves of the 1927 and 28 graphics from around 1250 onwards. Furthermore, the similar parts of the curves up to 1250 are not entirely congruent. How can this third riddle be explained or solved? The answer provided by previous research is that Bely changed his assessment of the curve over time. This answer might be accurate, but it is not entirely satisfactory. On the one hand, another early drawing, we already saw it, already shows the later curve. On the other hand, this earlier drawing also contains an answer to the question raised by the later curve representation. Let's switch back. Yes, right. This diagram shows that there are different lines of the Christ impulse or the development of the consciousness soul and manas that interact with each other. An esoteric, the blue line, and an exoteric, the red line. The blue line represents Christian initiation, but is largely hidden from external history. It is closely connected with manas, who, however, is not, as one might think, identical with mani. This referred to the spiritual individuality of a high initiate who, according to Rudolf Steiner, was embodied in the use of size, in the use of name, then in manas, and finally acted as the inspirer of Christian Rosenkreuz. The red line, on the other hand, shows how until the 12th century, the development of the Christ impulse manifested itself exoterically in selected and advanced individuals and movements. As Bely shows, using the example of Augustine, these individuals can be ambivalent, embodying the consciousness soul in idea rhythm and at the same time falling from it into the decadence, the first black wedge in the drawing. We find analogous explanations in the first volume of the text. When the blue and red lines touch in the 12th, 13th centuries in the Grail stream and then repel each other upwards and downwards again, they reflect the curve reversal that occurred with the entry of the Christ impulse into history in the 1st century. Bely writes in the first volume, I quote, "The first year and the 1250 year lie approximately at the same level. Between them is the line of the fall and subsequent rise of European culture," end of quote. This correspondence is accurate if the drawing is slightly corrected. Let's go on here. With the entry of the Christ impulse in the upper region of the intellectual soul, the curve already shown, which was one of the first, highlights precisely this correspondence. You see it on the right side. Up to this point, the earlier and later curves roughly coincide. After that, however, the curves diverge. The earlier graph shows the curve declining from the 12th, 13th century onwards, while in the later graph, it continues to rise until the 15th century. The low point of the earlier graph is the 16th century with Giordano Bruno, while the low point of the later graph is the 20th century. The downward shift of the line from the Grail moment to Bruno reflects how the connection to esoteric initiation of the spirit is diminishing. At the same time, the blue area, the influence of esoteric Christianity on exoteric history, decreases massively. However, at exactly this time in the 16th century, Luciferic forces on the one hand and Rosicrucians from the blue area on the other begin to influence the red line and raise it again from the spirit toward the spirit. Goethe's special position close to manas, as well as his rising line of representatives of the 19th century, stretching from Schopenhauer to Steiner, from the lower edge of the consciousness soul to the upper edge of our manas, corresponds to descriptions in the second volume of the text, which attributes to these individuals the development of the aforementioned higher soul forms as preliminary stages to manas. This line thus solves the riddle posed by the drawings of the 27-28 years. Under the influence of the esoteric sphere, these great individuals embark on the path of transformation earlier. Then this development occurs for the rest of humanity. The descent and ascent in the earlier diagram correspond to the two sides of the consciousness soul in Steiner's characterization. On the one hand, taking materialism and abstraction to extremes, and on the other hand, enabling spiritualization, starting from the ego with the beginning of the Rosicrucians' influence. The drawing thus reflects the course of the development of the Christ impulse in the vanguard of humanity, both esoterically and exoterically. The curve of the drawing from 97 and 28, on the other hand, is a theoretical line, as Bely repeatedly emphasized in the text about the curve of history. For him, the curve results from the interaction of various forces as their resultant. It is a hypothetical projection, but one that is intended to represent the Christ impulse at work beneath the surface of history, quasi in the unconsciousness or hidden realm of history. It therefore has no direct correspondence in persons or currents, as analyzed in the text. Thus, the stripes of Western cultures on the 1928 graph also run differently from this curve, even though they sometimes follow its course at a distance and in a staggered manner. So this proposal does not completely resolve the contradictions in the graphics, but I hope you can understand that we have to change only the perspectives onto the curves, and then we can understand that they are representing different points of view on the same thing. Thank you for your attention.
Sponsored by the Program for the Evolution of Spirituality.
Copyright 2023, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.